Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Murtazashvili. I am a professor at the School of Public and International Affairs and the founding director of the Center for Governance and Markets here at the University of Pittsburgh. Our center is a research center that explores the innovative ways people come together to solve problems. And if you've heard me give my spiel over the years, that when you look at the world from the bottom up, you can find a lot of cooperation. You can find people working together. You often see more cooperation than you do conflict. It's not always the case. So we approach these questions from a position of real curious dispassion. And as part of our work over the past several years, we've had a very long-standing research program called Governing Deep Differences. And over the past 3 years, we have explored the ways that individuals and communities navigate our increasingly polarized world. And polarization is a product of, we see it here in the United States, but it's really taking shape in just about every country you can imagine right now. And so as part of that work, we have hosted research in so many countries around the world, working with local research teams to understand from their perspective how individuals and communities are navigating the incredible time that we're living in. And so much of that research leaves us with great optimism. But here on our campus, we are determined to continue to provide space for voices from around the world whose societies are embroiled in some of the most difficult and intractable conflicts. So as part of this work, you've seen our scholars and researchers from Afghanistan, from Iran, from Ukraine, and also from the Middle East. So it's really a delight for us to have with us Nadav Eyal, who is one of Israel's most respected and well-known journalists. He is a senior research scholar and adjunct professor at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He's a senior commentator for Channel 12. So for those of you who watch Israeli media will know Channel 12. He's a columnist for Yediot Ahronot and Ynet News, Israel's most widely read newspaper and news site. He's the winner of the Sokolov Award, which is Israel's equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize. He's the author of the international bestseller Revolt, the worldwide uprising against globalization, for which he did some research here in the Pittsburgh region. And since October 7th, Nadav has been really one of the voices, I think, at the front lines, helping explain Israel's position, helping explain politics in the Middle East to wider audiences. And so he's a regular on the Call Me Back podcast with Dan Senor. So I'd like to welcome you to Call Yins Back, which is our version of a mini version here that we're going to walk you through over the next hour or so during the course of our conversation. So let me just walk you through how we're going to use our time. I'm going to ask Nadav a few questions. He'll respond, and then the last 15 or 20 minutes, we'll open the floor up to questions, and really eager to hear from you during the course of our conversation. So having said that, let's just begin, Nadav, with sort of the obvious question, the big elephant in the room. 2 nights ago, what is today? Monday. So last night, we saw Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner give a very triumphal talk on 60 Minutes, where they talked about, how they overcome all of these incredible differences at the negotiating table in, with President Netanyahu in Israel, with Middle Eastern partners, to achieve this really incredible 21-point plan. Is it 20 or 21 points?
That's debate.
Okay, I felt like I was getting something wrong. But yet, yesterday and last night here, at least in the United States, we saw many aspects of that plan seem to unravel, or at least it seemed. And so Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff hopped on a plane last night. I think they've already arrived in Israel. Just from your perspective, are we on the precipice of peace? Is this negotiated settlement that we saw going to last? There was so much optimism when we saw the hostages released and seeing these partners really stand together. And I think what was unique, at least from my perspective, is when you saw all of, what made this deal different from previous deals is that you saw the countries seemingly put their cards on the table, that they were committing in public to do something that maybe they had said that they would do in private. But it does seem that there's real cause for concern that the war may start again. We saw 2 Israeli soldiers killed this morning and increasing violence in Gaza. Just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here in Pittsburgh. I was supposed to come this spring and couldn't make it. So I really appreciate people who registered to the last event and came to this one. No, it's not a simple thing. And I'm very happy to be here in general. Last time I was here was back in 2020, and before that in 2016, not for Pittsburgh itself, but traveling from Pittsburgh to coal mining towns, not far from here, towards the US elections, 2016, then in 2020. That was a very valuable trip for me as a foreign correspondent covering US politics at the time, and to understand what's going to happen in these elections. So it's always a pleasure to be here, and specifically with the Pittsburgh University. So to your question, we're definitely not on the edge of peace in the Middle East. What we're having is a very ambitious ceasefire agreement that should lead at the second phase that didn't even begin towards a new order in the Gaza Strip, one that would be more stable and more focused on, let's say, security and some sort of stabilization that will allow the rebuilding of Gaza and more security to the Israelis. And there's a lot to rebuild. This has been a devastating war to Israelis, to Palestinians. We had dozens of thousands of people who died, the 1,200 people who were murdered in Israel on October 7, the dozens of thousands who have died in Gaza. Gaza is, some areas of Gaza are completely destroyed. So there's a lot to do there. But this is a two-phase deal. The first phase is about stopping the war, getting the hostages out, a prisoner exchange as far as Hamas is concerned. And the second phase is, of course, what you just referred to as the 20 or 21 points made by President Trump. These include a sort of a Palestinian self-governance in Gaza that isn't Hamas and isn't exactly the Palestinian Authority, somehow monitored or assisted by an international body that the president calls a council or a board of peace, led by him himself and Tony Blair somehow, and the ISF, sort of an international security force that will be placed in Gaza between Israel and maybe Hamas, that is supposed to be disarmed, and Gaza is supposed to be demilitarized. These are all very ambitious goals. And here's the short version. We're not close to having these implemented at all. And if you listen to the interviews given by, for instance, J.D. Vance in the last 24 hours, or the things that are being said by the president, and I'm listening very, very carefully to what the administration is saying, because it's this administration who's calling the shots here. It's not the sides, it's not the Israeli government. There isn't a master plan that was drawn in Jerusalem that is being implemented by this White House or by President Trump. If you actually listen to what's happening, then you see that it's the Americans who are going to time this, who are going to make their decisions as to what's going to happen here. And they themselves admit that we're not that close to that second phase. And I thought that it was extremely revealing that the vice president himself said, there are stuff, I'm paraphrasing, there are stuff we still don't know of how this is going to work. But this is the general direction, this is the vector that this administration has called for. And it's a very interesting perception of what's going to happen in Gaza. And I think that to a large extent, it was inevitable on two different levels. First level is that the idea is that Hamas will just surrender, they'll leave their bunkers with their hands in the air, they'll return the hostages, and they'll say, basically, how do we build back into a civilian society that never actually was in Gaza, at least since 1948, sort of after World War II situation, denazification of sorts. I think that this was always not a very realistic scenario, to say the least. Well, I was never pitching that, if you listen to me on Call Me Back. I always thought it's going to end with some sort of an agreement of reform, of change. And the hope is that this change would be, realistically speaking, transformational. It would take time, right? So that's one layer of what we're seeing right now. And another layer is that if you think about what Hamas is a fundamentalist religious political movement that is associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Resistance, as they label it, violence and terrorism, as it is labeled by most Western countries, is absolutely part of the political DNA of Hamas. And because of that, expecting them to hand over their weapons or decide that they're now a political party, that's very ambitious. And to the credit of the plan made by the US government, they understood that. They understood that, again, in distinct levels. First of all, the 21 points or the 20 points says that even if Hamas doesn't abide by the plan, still Israel will continue its withdrawals and hand over territory to that ISF, which is very significant. And I can tell you that the Israeli government is not too happy about that specific clause, right? So that's one level. Another level is that it's absolutely the case that this ceasefire and this plan would have never been accepted if not for the support enlisted from across the region by Arab governments. And of course, the Palestinian Authority itself in Ramallah. They all support the plan because they all understand that if Hamas will maintain its position as having a monopoly over violence in the Gaza Strip, at least in the Palestinian populated areas of the Gaza Strip, there is absolutely no hope to rebuild Gaza. If you were Saudi Arabia or the UAE or even Qatar, would you want to start rebuilding Gaza knowing that Hamas is rebuilding its force towards another round of hostilities with Israel? Because this is the basic tenet of the idea that as far as Hamas is concerned, Palestine will only be freed through blood and fire. And the answer is no. And this is what I'm hearing from my Arab sources. They don't want to invest in Gaza before they understand that Gaza isn't back to business as usual of October 6, 2023, just before the Hamas invasion into Israel, the morning of October 7th. So to your question, we made a significant stride here with the ceasefire and with having a unified vision regionally of how Gaza should look like. The fact that Israelis and Palestinians, by the way, and of course, at least on the record, Hamas, and Qatar and the UAE and Egypt and Jordan have agreed to that vision is extremely significant. And it's a major win for this administration. And I'm saying this as someone not wading in to the political discussion in the US. I know that everything, even in my country, if you say it's a major win to the government, you're automatically labeled, right? I'm not doing that. I have my own trouble back in Israel, which we can discuss politically speaking. So I don't want to do that. It's exactly like the attack against the Iranian nuclear installations. I knew from my sources that we're not American, that the damages to the Iran nuclear program was significant. And I could see how this is played within the American arena politically on both sides. So I'm not there. I'm just saying what I'm hearing and verifying through my own sources. This is a major win. It's a major win in the sense that hostages are back home, live hostages are back home. The reason I have this pin with me now, because I'm still in touch with the families of hostages who have died, and their bodies, after they have been murdered, their bodies have been abducted into Gaza, which is a terrible scenario as of itself. And they are still looking for their loved ones to be returned. This is part of the deal. And so I'm not gonna, any of you can make your own decisions. I'm not dropping the pin until they have their loved ones back home. They can bury them and they can grieve them. But this win is because the war has stopped with a vision as to the future. Whether or not this vision could actually be implemented in full is still a question, and it's going to be determined by the resolve of both sides, but also by the resolve of this administration. And the fact that the administration understood, I would say even intuitively, that when the hostages are back home, legitimacy for the war to be litigated will be gone. And that hostages are the heart of the problem. The fact that they understood this and they managed to enlist Qatar and Turkey to pressure Hamas into this position, and also to get, according to the same interview you just mentioned, Jen, if you listen to the interview, pressure the Israelis into that, which they definitely spoke about at length. The fact that they managed to do that is a substantial achievement, and that very fact is important. But that doesn't mean it cannot collapse tomorrow morning. This is the Middle East. Everything is hard in the Middle East. War is hard, peace is hard, ceasefires are hard too.
So, just to follow up on that, I have two questions, okay? Number one, there's a lot of people who say that, and even within Israeli society, that this is a deal that could have been struck a year ago, that this war didn't have to continue, lives didn't have to be lost. This could have been done. On the other hand, we didn't see the regional players come out in quite the same way they did a year ago. And to me, that's what makes this agreement more credible, right? That we didn't see that a year ago. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
So that's an excellent question, and my answer is very straightforward, because there are a lot of false narratives that are going around, and I'm going to mention two false narratives. The first false narrative is that this entire plan was somehow geniusly engineered by the Netanyahu government. They always knew that it's going to come to this. They wanted this plan. Anyone who just watched the 60 Minutes interview, listen to President Trump speaking with Sean Hannity the night that this agreement was reached, saying he told Bibi that Israel can't fight with the entire world, knows that this narrative is simply untrue, at least if it's pitched so plainly like that. The other narrative is what you just mentioned. The same agreement could have been reached a year ago, and it's just because of the Israeli government that it didn't happen. And sometimes it's even pitched by the Israeli opposition.
He wanted to stay in power, right?
Yeah, it's all about lengthening the war. So I never look. I'm definitely not usually accused in Israel in overly defending Netanyahu. Let's say, put it this way, and it's a big understatement to say the least. Usually, Jen told me that sometimes there are like interruptions or heckling or something. Usually I'm being heckled or interrupted or, cursed online for criticizing the Netanyahu government. Okay, usually this is the case. But when I write it in English, it changes, right? And it becomes a more diverse crowd that's cursing me. So I'm definitely not an automatic defender of the coalition, to say the least. However, there was no agreement like that a year ago, and this is not me saying that. This is my sources with the Biden administration, senior sources, which I called after this agreement was reached, and they said, hell no, we didn't have that agreement. And our problem was mainly with Hamas. And here's what I mean. I can be very granular as to this, if you're interested. This agreement could never be reached a year ago because Hamas always said, you get the last hostage. We will release all the hostages. They always said that, by the way. That's true. We will release all the hostages when you leave the Gaza Strip last inch of territory. You will never be able to stay in Gaza. They didn't even want to recognize a perimeter around the Gaza Strip because they saw that as trampling on the idea of Palestinian sovereignty, them losing territory. The fact that they agreed to an agreement to return all the live hostages, at once in 3 days. We never thought that's going to be the case. Whoever listens to me on Call Me Back knows that the assessment was that they're going to have a drawn-out process. They're going to lengthen it, maybe for years. I don't know how many of you remember how many years Gilad Shalit was in captivity, right? It wasn't 2 years.
5 years.
So the idea that they will hold onto these hostages, these poor hostages in their dungeons for years on end, was always there. And that the IDF will remain in of Gaza. Rafah was the home of 1 billion Palestinians. It's now fully controlled by the IDF, and they've agreed to a ceasefire. Khan Yunis is completely controlled by the IDF. So the notion that this agreement could have been reached a year ago is just nonsense.
So why did they agree?
Right. However, I want to say something there because nuance is my thing, and it's very out of fashion. Really, seriously, it's not good for my social presence online. Really, it's very bad. I should justify everything this side does or the other side does, and just do it intelligently or not so intelligently. That would be much better for my followers' numbers. An agreement could have been reached a year ago, but not this agreement. So I want to be very specific about that. There were agreements on the table a year ago. And these agreements also were supposed to facilitate the return of all the hostages. How do I know that? Because Israel signed such an agreement. And we got many, many hostages back in January, if you remember that. That was the first phase. Second phase was supposed to return all the hostages. And Israel decided to break that ceasefire. That's just the truth. And why? Because Israel said that Hamas will never agree to disarm, which is another thing that indeed wasn't the case. That's true. Hamas said it will not disarm and will not return all the hostages until the entire territory will be free. Now, if you're asking the Netanyahu critics, they'll tell you Israel should have taken the agreement a year ago that was worse than this one, released more hostages that since have died, or taken even the agreement back in the summer of 24. We had 6 hostages that were murdered by Hamas in that tunnel, including Hersh Goldberg Polen. Taken that agreement, and then if Hamas would have violated, and it would have violated because we're already seeing them violating, and the Israeli defense apparatus continued saying to the government, sign an agreement now, they will violate the agreement, then do whatever you want to do in Gaza, no restraints, because the presence of the hostages there restrains the ability of Israel to do stuff. That was their recommendation. And these people who made that recommendation, Jen, are still extremely resolved that it was a mistake to wait for this agreement. Because they're saying, yeah, we control 50% of the territory. Yeah, they've agreed in principle to disarm. Then what? We could have been with much more international legitimacy a year ago. We could have been in a completely different situation a year ago. What we have lost in this year, we didn't gain in our year of presence or in this agreement. Now, I'm going to say another something that is nuanced. We don't know. The jury is still out. Because it really depends on the end result, right?
When President Trump says, I played this video actually.
I never tend to interpret what the president say.
Well, okay, so he was talking.
He's always very clear. Seriously.
He says, if they don't, it was like how I think I should talk to my children, right? If they don't disarm, well, and the reporter says, well, what if they don't disarm? They will disarm. How do you know they're going to disarm? Because I know they will disarm. Well, what guarantees do you have that they're disarmed? Trust me, they'll disarm. If they don't disarm, so this went on. Is there any credibility behind?
So first, I want to say something to the credit of President Trump. And I know I'm saying this in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I'm giving him credit here.
Yeah, okay.
Because I'm trying to understand the credibility mechanism that's behind what he's saying.
So I don't know about mechanisms yet, but I want to say something to the credit of the president. And I wanted to speak because this is a governance center. I want to say something about governance and about leadership in general. One of the things that we expect our leaders to do in their prime and their best is to expand the field of possibilities. We don't need our leaders to go into a room and to say, you know, I'm weighing the different constraints of a situation. I'm weighing what can be done and can't be done, and to just explain to us reasonably the status quo. And this is what many leaders have been doing as to the Middle East for many years. In other words, they do want to be ambitious about their goals as to the Middle East, because if you are ambitious and you're not going to get to that target, that goal of everlasting peace in the Middle East, then that's going to count as a failure for you, right? So you don't want to be caught red-handed. You don't want to be embarrassed. You would rather take the low-hanging fruits or be less ambitious and not discuss it too much. And even if you do sign an agreement, right, and it gets violated, maybe have your press secretary talk about the need for both sides to uphold the agreement. Maybe distance yourself. Create some sort of a productive daylight between you and the agreement that you just engineered, so you won't be blamed. This is not what the president has been doing. And this is the reason why the president has become extremely popular in Israeli right-wing spheres. Now he's very popular with what Americans would label liberal Israeli spheres today. President said, not only we are going to get a ceasefire, it's the right thing to do for Hamas to disarm. Now, by doing that, Jen, he was listening to the same people I'm speaking with in the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Egypt that can't say this on record, but understand that if Hamas is armed, there's no future for Gaza in terms of rebuilding Gaza. So the fact that he was expanding the sea of possibilities, that he wasn't, just playing along with this, that's so meaningful, and that's the reason we achieved this agreement to begin with. Now, as to how it's actually going to be implemented, Hamas is testing the world, it's testing the Israelis and the Americans. And right now, they're extremely successful. What did they discover since the agreement was signed? First of all, they discovered that if they don't return all the bodies of Israelis that they have, it's not back to business. The Israelis are not reinvading their enclave in Gaza. They're not resuming the war. Now, Israeli intelligence knows that they can return many more bodies of Israelis. These are people who were either murdered in captivity, person like Arya Zamanovich, in his 80s, murdered in captivity, and they're holding to his body. Or people who were murdered at the Nova Festival, and they abducted the bodies. So, and they're holding to these bodies, and the war can't resume. Secondly, they just had a lethal attack against the IDF. That was a coordinated attack. This wasn't like two terrorists that didn't get the memo. These were people who were going out of the tunnel. It was a coordinated attack of two forces that killed two Israeli soldiers. By the way, you probably noticed that this war is never portrayed in the international media, and definitely not in demonstrations, as a war. It's always portrayed as an onslaught of the Israelis against the Palestinians in Gaza. It was never, ever discussion. People don't know the Israelis are dying in Gaza in combat situations against a real armed force there, because it's so tilted. But bias aside, what we're seeing as far as Hamas is concerned is that they can also have guerrilla warfare against these outposts of the Israelis left on 50% of the territory. Now that Hamas says, here's the status quo. In this enclave, aid is entering as usual. We control this enclave 100%. Hamas is killing their adversaries. It's rounding up the opposition, including just people who wrote posts on Facebook, in makeshift detention centers, in hospitals. And this is not me saying that. These are Palestinians from Gaza who are writing this online, interrogating, killing, torturing their rivals. And Qatar and Turkey have presence within that enclave, assisting them to start to rebuild. Well, that's a big challenge. So to the question of what the president will actually do, at the end of the day, he can always say, you know what? He started saying that. They're violating the agreement. You Israelis go into that enclave. Now your hands are not tied because you fear the lives of your hostages. Go into that enclave and destroy Hamas. Have a full military occupation of the Gaza Strip, which Israel doesn't have right now. Population in the Gaza Strip is not controlled by Israelis. It's controlled by Hamas. That's what he's saying, and I'm not sure that it won't come to this. As far as Netanyahu is concerned, he's going to have one hell of a political problem if this is going to be the status quo. Occasional attacks of Hamas and the guerrilla warfare, them holding the bodies of Israelis, rebuilding their power in that enclave. He's not going to win an election, I suspect, if this continues to be the case. However, the constituents are completely aware that if the president says you can't go in, Israel can't go in. Israel is wholly dependent on the United States on this, and in general. If the president says it's a green light, Israel can do it. If he says it's a red light, Israel is not going to do it. And Israel has never been that dependent as it is today.
So I think the last question, where I'm going to take us back, has to do with reconstruction. There was a great deal of criticism leveled at President Netanyahu because he refused, or
Prime Minister, I have to
sorry,
correct you with
Prime Minister.
I just
I
have
know,
to.
we got presidents in the
Yeah.
brain. I didn't call him President Trump. So Prime Minister Netanyahu, he refused, either couldn't or refused to articulate a day after plan.
Yeah.
This was something that he came under significant, in his government, significant criticism for, that there was, the soldiers were sent to fight, there was never a plan, the people of Gaza never had hope for a future. And I think even you leveled this criticism against him. I've had the chance to look at a lot of reconstruction.
Like 200,000 times.
Yes, we heard you.
Yeah.
You know, I spent decades in, working on Afghanistan, in Afghanistan, and what I saw there, and Iraq as well, is the US had beautiful plans. They were gorgeous. And in fact, if I was going to write a reconstruction plan, they'd look like, Field Manual 3-24 that Petraeus and his team came up with to counterinsurgency strategy, reconstruction effort, clear, hold, build. It was beautiful. I fell in love with these documents when I read them. They were so profoundly unrealistic because they were never tied to a war fighting goal. It was about what the reconstruction would look like without a clear sense of what the war was about. What would victory look like? What would the end of fighting look like? What was the war aim? Thousands of Americans died in these wars, I think, without clear military objectives. What I always saw in Israel and Gaza was, in Gaza, it seemed as if there was a semblance of a military objective. We can debate, about the contours of that, but there couldn't be a reconstruction effort until you understood what the end of the war looked like. If, Sinwar was still alive, imagine drafting a reconstruction effort or a day after plan with him still around. And as Israel sort of gained control of parts of the Gaza Strip, of course, Hamas is still in control of Gaza City and other parts. of the Gaza Strip. But now you have the possibility in the areas that are outside of Hamas's control for reconstruction to happen, have a clearer sense of what the end of the war can look like. The possibilities are limited, I think, than they were even 6 months, 3 months ago. I think that was one of the advantage. I mean, when Israel pressed on Gaza City, it seemed like this was the end of the war. One way or the other, this battle would be sort of the climax, the end. Hopefully the hostages will be released. You know, President Trump says they'll disarm. But will we see reconstruction then, you know, take place in these areas outside of Gaza City? Have a Gaza emerge from this? To me, this criticism that you needed a day after plan, you have to articulate this. To me, it just seems so unrealistic to get people to credibly commit to anything until it was clear what the war should look like. And to the fact that anyone in Israel would listen to our generals. They're very smart people. They came up with wonderful ideas, but they had no sense of what a realistic post-conflict reconstruction would look like.
So first of all, it's a fair critique. And it comes from an expert, right? You dealt with Afghanistan so many years. I want to say something about that. I never thought that it was about the plan. And in that regard, there is a famous quote by President Eisenhower you probably know very well. It's all about plans. Plans are not important, but planning is everything. And I think that this is absolutely the case. Could the United States garner the little legitimacy that it had in occupying Iraq, a terrible mistake as of itself, if it didn't say that it wants to liberate the Iraqis? It was called Operation Iraqi Freedom. Now, did it matter, right? Was this really the agenda of the Iraq war? It wasn't. Very clear it wasn't, right? Because the US went to, it's not me interpreting, the US went to the UN Security Council and said it was about WMDs, and also because of other reasons, but it wasn't about Operation Iraqi Freedom. It wasn't us doing a favor to the Iraqi people, or Americans doing a favor to the Iraqi people. Israel did not have any positive vision to Gaza. It still doesn't. With no positive vision into Gaza, the question that is the most material question for policy is constantly being evaded. Realistically speaking, what is your most optimistic scenario? And I would always ask decision makers exactly that in reference to their own policies. Realistically speaking, what's your most positive scenario? And if you don't have a scenario to portray, either because you're hiding it, because you have a hidden agenda, or because you have no idea, there's no way you're going to win this. Now, the goal of the war, there are two goals of the war. They're very specific, and by the way, they're very prudent. The first one was to release the hostages. Israel did that. There were 3 hostage deals. The first one, humanitarian, in which the women and children were released. The second one was a hostage deal in which many, also men and people over 40, 50 were released. Third one was this one. And although Israel had many failures along the way, including instances in which the IDF bombed the wrong place in the wrong time, and many other tragedies, it set out this goal. For most Israelis, according to polls, this was the most important goal. Now, I know that many people get absolutely agitated in the Jewish community, in the Israeli community when I say that, but it's just the truth that you go poll after poll, study after study, this was the most important goal. The second goal was never to destroy Hamas. Destroy something is not a military goal, right? The second goal was to take away Hamas' military ability to pose a threat to Israel like it had on October 7th, and make sure that it does not govern the Gaza Strip. Hamas already agrees in principle, although they're cheating, that they won't govern the Gaza Strip. By the way, they agreed to that a year ago, or more than a year ago, to commit that they won't govern the Gaza Strip. What they actually need is that they're going to rule the Gaza Strip through deterrence and through their arms behind the scenes, while having a weak government they can hide behind. That's not a positive scenario. But in principle, they already said we're willing to let go of the Gaza Strip. Militarily speaking, they have been crushed to the extent that they pose no threat right now for another October 7, or even, a fraction of that. But they can rebuild. Now, this goes to the very essence of what you dealt with, Jen, with Afghanistan and other places. How do you actually de-radicalize? Societies that are enlisted, or large parts of the societies are enlisted, in this case, to fundamentalist jihadi ideas. How can you, as an outsider, assist de-radicalization? And you know what? There aren't good answers out there. There aren't good experiences. And sometimes they bring all types of experiences, even from within the Middle East. And I know countries that are pushing that idea that they have de-radicalized. Yeah, well, let's see that when these countries are full-blown liberal democracies, which they aren't. Then we'll see if they succeeded in de-radicalization programs. Even if they have these fancy centers of de-radicalization, when you don't have freedom of speech, real freedom of speech, you don't really know. So I don't know, and nobody knows. However, I'm much more hopeful about Gaza. And I'm saying something that's a bit surprising in that regard. The reason I'm hopeful about Gaza and about the Palestinian society in general is that it is the most highly educated society in the Arab world. I'm just talking about plain, education, academic education. Gaza is condensed. It's small. And one of the big problems as to Afghanistan and Iraq was just the sheer size of it. And I do think that after such a brutal war, societies have a tendency to incentivize at least a long period of rebuilding. Now, I'm being very realistic about that. I know what Islamic Jihad and Hamas are all about. We have seen this. And these elements are absolutely destructive. And they're highly supported by their respective societies. But they can definitely not say that they have won the day. And you hear that from Gazans. They understand the humiliation in this agreement. And they also understand that they're cornered, because the entire region, including Turkey and Qatar, doesn't want this to blow up right now. And because of that, I think that there is a chance to see something in Gaza we didn't see in other places. There's a sliver of chance. So I don't want to expand on that. And I don't want the take-home message to be, Gaza is just going to be a thriving Singapore. I don't know. But I think that there's a possibility there for a real change if we work and we insist upon it. And specifically, if we insist that radicals don't get their way in the Palestinian society, which is where I think that the international, let's say, intellectual elite has basically failed the region and failed the Palestinians. Focusing so much on ending the war, which is something I definitely agree with. I wanted the war to end immediately with the return of the hostages and a different governance in the Gaza Strip. I think it's and understanding and empathizing with the suffering of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza is, of course, absolutely legitimate and warranted. They have never understood that Hamas is a strategic threat, and it represents a strategic threat to peace and to humanitarian values. It is not a byproduct of the conflict. Hamas would have existed even if there would have been a Palestinian state on all the 1967 borders, the entire West Bank. East Jerusalem would have been divided, and I don't know, Israeli airplanes would have infringed on Gazan air sovereignty. Hamas would have existed because Hamas is a grassroots movement that represents a larger grassroots movement within the Arab and the Muslim Ummah. And it is a threat to moderate regimes everywhere. And it has a different idea of how to live in the world and vis-a-vis the world. And because of that, the fact that this intellectual elite was so focused on criticizing Israel, indicting Israel, scapegoating Israel, focusing on stopping the war immediately, a ceasefire immediately. Now, what's the reason that they have suddenly been so non-existent when the ceasefire has been reached? Why isn't there like demonstrations in which people thank themselves for pressuring to that ceasefire and say, we have won, there is a ceasefire in Gaza, the hostages are back home. By the way, 1,700 Palestinian prisoners were also released, hundreds of which convicted for sometimes for murder or assisting murder. Why wasn't there, maybe there was, and I'm missing this, and Pitt, why did they convene in the center of campus saying, great, we won, you know, peace in the Middle East, or at least a ceasefire in the Middle East? Why didn't they do that? And the answer is, to me, I'm going to give it an answer because it was a rhetorical, is that that's not what they're interested in. They don't really care about the ceasefire or stopping the violence in the Middle East. It's not about that. It's about a much more radical perception of reality and a goal out there, one that does involve violence and has violence in its very, its very DNA. And sometimes you even hear the kind of frustration coming from these crowds, even sadness that this agreement has been reached, although the agreement includes a recognition by Netanyahu to national self-determination and stated for the Palestinians, as well as a withdrawal of the Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, even if Hamas doesn't hold up to all the tenets of the agreement. What else could someone ask for? But that's not enough, because Israel survives this. And the region needs to be transformed through the voice of moderates and not through some sort of a radical notion of what sometimes these demonstrators call justice.
So I was going to ask you a battery of questions about the Abraham Accords and their extensions, but I think maybe we'll save some of that for the Q&A.
Sure.
One of my favorite Israeli academics, Netta Barak Cohen, she's at Hebrew University. She's done some really, never met her.
We're friends.
Okay, I've read some of her work on post-conflict reconstruction, but also on radicalization. And, universities produce a lot of education, but can also produce a lot of radicalization. And one of the things that she pointed out was that in a study that she did, she found that actually efforts to delegitimize the state of Israel, or BDS efforts, have actually escalated during periods of ceasefires. To me, that was a sort of a counterintuitive and a surprising result. So I wanted to ask you, about the position of Israel. You mentioned in a previous comment that the war went on an extra for this past year. Israel's international reputation took a significant hit during this period of time. How does Israel regain that reputation? We see the delegitimization of Israel, among European countries, even things as mundane as Eurovision, right? That this is sort of taking on a
Worse than Eurovision.
Worse, but it's sort of spreading like a fever, on our campuses and throughout the world. How do you see Israel repositioning itself?
So first of all, I don't think it's a problem of how things seem. It's not a problem of what the Israelis call hasbara. It's a fundamental problem within the Israeli society that needs to be solved. And the reason it's a nuanced condition is that there's a blood libel there, but there's also mistakes made by Israel during the war. And sometimes when you speak on just one element of that, people would use that element that you spoke about the mistakes made or the criticism leveled. If you speak only about the other side, then you're not being really truly honest with yourself. And I'm a journalist, so my job is to criticize the Israeli government. This is what I get paid for, is to expose stuff that people wanted hidden or analysis that is not agreeable with people in power. And I think that there were many, many mistakes made, many, many mistakes. But the argument as to lengthening the war is not my argument. This is an argument by senior ministers in the Likud, in the cabinet room, months and months ago, in which they told the prime minister in no uncertain terms, whatever you're gonna gain in Gaza, it's not worth the damage that we're taking internationally. It's not worth it. The legitimacy of Israel is paramount for its existence. And this is not an easy crisis to solve. And if someone wants to tell himself that it's just a matter of time will heal everything, I think it's a grossly mistaken assessment of what's happening.
So I'll address it.
What we're seeing is both an aligned campaign against Israel, trying to delegitimize it in ways never seen before against any country that committed anything. The idea that it should be just disintegrated or destroyed, that violence against it is legitimate. These are ideas that even if you see Israel as a settled colony, which it isn't, then you don't see the demonstrations arguing that Australia needs to be disintegrated or destroyed as a result of that. That's definitely a settled colony by the book. And the reason that you're seeing this with Israel is because there are forces pushing this behind the scenes. Also, there's a war brewing. There isn't a war in Australia right now. There are many, many innocent people that have lost their lives in Gaza. No one should deny that. And Israel also has conducted itself in a way that really contributed to the somewhat unfair criticisms leveled against it. Now, I know that what I said here is very contradictory. It's very confusing. But this is life. This is the real fabric of reality. And by the way, for me at least, it's a Jewish tradition of seeing what's wrong in what you do and trying to fix it, not telling yourself, praising yourself all the time. That's not the type of Judaism I want to practice or I see myself as part of, but that's a very personal remark. What needs to be done here is to have, first of all, a serious plan of the Israeli state to counter delegitimization efforts. It's Israel that needs to assemble this. It's Israel that not the Jewish communities abroad, not students and that need to do that. They need to say that. I'll just give you one example. So the reason I was almost late here is because I was part of an academic conference about Zionism in Columbia University, that by the way went very well, and I was on Zoom. And during that conference, there was a presentation there of what happens when you ask young people, Jews and non-Jews, as to what they think of Zionism. And there's a 20% jump, both with young people who are Jewish and young people who are not Jewish, when you simply say, Zionism meaning that the Jewish people have the right for national self-determination. And then there's a 20-point jump in the support or the people who are identified as Zionists. Why? Because many, many people don't know anything about Zionism. And they just see Zionism as everything that's wrong in Israel right now, or for instance, settlements in the West Bank, which I see personally as anti-Zionism. And my opinion is not a radical opinion of settlements in the West Bank, but it's very much shared by the mainstream of the Israeli, let's say, center-left. It's not that small these days or in general, right? But anything that's negative about Israel for these people is Zionism. But Zionism is a very, very short definition of thinking that Jews can have a state like any other people in the world. By the way, the Palestinians, who have their own right for national self-determination. And the fact that this notion has become toxic is the result of ignorance and a deliberate campaign, which is toxic and sometimes anti-Semitic. And of course, there are those who say, yeah, everybody does have a right for national self-determination, but Jews do not. And these people are just plain, rabid anti-Semites. This is what they are. And you need to somehow confront that. You need to confront that, first of all, by saying what Zionism is. This is the reason that education and information and facts matter. And if you don't say that, if you don't explain that, someone needs to do that, then you're just opening yourself to these kind of campaigns. And of course, you have social networks these days, and it's much easier to be a bigot these days than it was 30 years ago when I was growing up. Because 30 years ago, in order to be a bigot, you needed to stand in a classroom like this, raise your hand and say something bigoted against Jews or against people of color or something else. And then the room would immediately ostracize you. And this is how the world worked. Today, you just write a mean comment on X, on Twitter, or send it to your friends in Snap, and many, many people would be appalled, but there will always be 2 or 3 people who will feel very comfortable with what you said, and you will feel empowered to make another mean comment. And this is the way that these things go. So it's a huge challenge to Jews who consider themselves Zionists. It's a huge challenge for the state of Israel. For me, it's a huge challenge for decent people everywhere, not only people who are part of the Jewish community. And we need to confront that. We need to have leadership to confront that, an accountable leadership that's willing and sophisticated enough. Also, by the way, to admit our mistakes. So some of these things depend on that you say, for instance, we want to have a better life for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. We think it's absolutely necessary for ourselves to have good neighbors. We're willing to assist that. If there are mistakes made during the war, to own up to these mistakes. There's nothing bad that's going to happen to you by doing that. Only good things can stem out of that. Now, why didn't the Israeli government or coalition do that during the war in many cases? Because it would have hurt them in their political base. Because they feared retribution, politically speaking, within their own electorate. That's the truth. And that goes to being brave enough to lead. That sometimes means, again, a very Jewish idea, at least at its core, that you need to say difficult stuff to the people that you lead, not constantly praise them. That's what the founders of the State of Israel called according to the tradition of the prophets of Israel. That tradition is of people shouting at the people of Israel saying, you have deviated from your moral values. Return to your moral values. I think it's very important. I'm going to stop now and open it up, I guess, Jen, for questions and remarks and short speeches. Could see this questions.
Yes, thank you, Nadav.
I was thinking just talking to them.
Yeah, we can hear everyone, I guess.
Yes, I'll be there.
I can be loud. So my name's Andrew. I'm a second-year master's student here, and I am a research assistant for CGM. There is really an anti-Semitism problem here on campus. A lot of my classmates say, well, Hamas are the freedom fighters. I'm a fascist for saying that they're terrorists. And one of the big conspiracies they float around is something you mentioned briefly. The idea that Trump is in the pocket of Israel, that it's some worldwide conspiracy. And you said that's obviously not true. In fact, it might be the opposite. Like Prime Minister Netanyahu has to follow what Trump and Vance say. So if you can explore that more, if you can talk more about.
First of all, I feel very sorry, and I am saying this sincerely, I'm very sorry to hear that, because what you described is a classic blood libel with very overtones of anti-Semitic archetypes. The idea that Jews control everything, it's all a widespread conspiracy, and I'm really disheartened to hear that people will be making these remarks in any academic institution. But to the question, you just need to hear the remarks made by President Trump, but now by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, to understand that this was not a plan that was masterminded by Israel. It's a very difficult plan for the Israelis to accept, in the sense that just look at the implementation right now. Israel is extremely dependent on the United States. And we also know, for instance, what was the American reaction to the failed attack in Qatar. We also know that Israel wanted, for instance, to have more attacks in Iran, and it needed to drive back the airplanes. Now, here's the problem. You probably know all this, right? The problem is that when you explain this to conspiracy theorists, they always have another question mark, another explanation. They are just asking questions after they research Facebook, or today Snapchat, or something, I don't know, TikTok. And to that, some of these people could never be introduced back to the world of fact. What's really going on there is that some very, very deep anti-Semitic vibes have been let loose by this war. And the fact that I just had what I would want to regard as a nuanced conversation about what Israel did in the war and the mistakes, no mistake. I don't want you to feel going out of this room as though I am not recognizing the level of anti-Semitism exposed as a result of October 7 and the response on campuses on October 8. I do. I just focus on the stuff that I think I can correct within myself before I focus on others. But I think that what was exposed was not only appalling, it was a sort of an orthodoxy throughout our higher institution, education institution, that is very dangerous. It's not only dangerous for the Israelis or dangerous for the Jews. It's dangerous for our societies. It's dangerous for the idea of progress. And there was an idea, the idea of the generation of the age of progress, of enlightenment, the idea that facts matter, that proof matters, and that you can have a factual discussion, and you're entitled for your opinions, but not for your own facts. Jews have always been the victim of eras in which facts counted less than opinions and radicalism and bigotry. And I fear that we are on the edge of such an era. I want to believe that this was a small phase that will end soon, but I'm not sure.
Thank you so much. One quick thing as a follow-up. You talked about how there is this movement on campus. Do you think places like Iran, foreign entities, are meddling in this?
I don't know. I guess so. I guess so. But there are several reports and think tanks that have dealt with that.
I'll check that out. Thank you.
You mentioned earlier, this is more of a
What's your name?
question. Andrea Schmidt. You mentioned earlier that you think Israel needs to be taking the lead on correcting some of these misperceptions in the international community. I think the problem is that when the corrections are coming from Israel and the Jewish community here and abroad, we're very much accused of bias, that we can't possibly know the truth because we are so victimized by propaganda, and we're so, this is part of our identity, so how could we possibly be balanced in understanding, what the real situation is? I'm just wondering, what you think the non-Jewish and non-Israeli communities responsible.
And the source of the question is really a problem of our age, which is, it reflects the other question. It's not about what you say, it's about who you are. And that's we can basically close down our institutions of higher education because all of us have identities, right? And if I just open up every class that I have with acknowledging my biases, I don't have enough time, right? I have so many biases. I come to this with my opinions, with my experiences, with my privileges, which I acknowledge, right? It's not about that. And that's part of the problem with the entire discourse. It's all about who you are and not, or what's your identity in the form defined by DEI ideas and not what you're saying. Is it valid? Is it factual? Is it even wise? Is it clever? Is it practical? Does it help us to understand better the world? These universities sometimes are about finding new stuff. But yeah, let's face it, we're not sitting here. I'm not, there's a geologist in the room, right? But they discover new stuff sometimes, occasionally, right? But what we do in social sciences, to the extent that they are sciences, is we find better ways to understand the world, right? And that's always biased to some extent. Saying that is to a large extent just an infantilization of our entire discourse. The ancient Greeks knew that everybody has history and they dealt with that. That's why we have our methods, the scientific method and others. We have peer review. We have many, many ways to say, is this practical? Isn't this analysis new? Can this help us? Is it true? And then if we come to that discussion, leaving our presumed identities outside of the room or trying to, and weighing things according to what they are, or trying to, we've done something. And to answer your question, everybody who's demonstrating has some skin in the game. Sometimes even if they can say, I'm Jewish myself and I am against Zionism. That's a bias of sorts. I have no connection to the conflict, right? Yeah, maybe you've been in church once. Same church that said for 2,000 years the Jews murdered Christ. So, right, it's just an absurd, the fact that you need to even answer these kind of protests is just an absurdity of our time. It's just a waste of our time.
Hi, my name's Zach. I'm an undergrad here. You said earlier that Hamas is not a byproduct of sort of the long-term Israel-Palestine conflict.
It's only a byproduct. So it's good. It's good that you asked the question. It's very important for me to make that clear. It's also a byproduct. But I said it would have existed even if the conflict would be over. Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I was going to add to that is that there's a strong connection between economic opportunity and radicalization. And as we look for a realistic, optimistic objective, I don't know how we can have that conversation without also thinking about the economic opportunities within Gaza. And in my mind, that would require like Marshall Plan levels of investment and rebuilding. And I don't see that happening in the 20-point plan or in anywhere else. How do we have our realistic, optimistic objective without investment?
So that's absolutely the vision of President Trump, to the credit of this White House, that there would be huge investments into Gaza. Of course, the president is saying it's not the US that's going to make these investments. It's not going to be US taxpayers' money. By the way, I wrote in my first book about the Marshall Plan and how it was presented. It was never, ever a popular thing in this country, to the extent they tried to hide it from the American public. When the plan was out, they timed the speech by Marshall so that the American public will hear about this after the European audiences heard about it, because it was not popular, because giving taxpayers money to people you don't know is never popular after a war that you didn't begin, you didn't start, right? There is a plan there is a vision by the president, and there is a commitment of countries, to their credit, like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, unfortunately for me, Qatar, and other countries to rebuild Gaza on a Marshall Plan level. But for that to survive, you need to have stability of governance. And if this entity, this polity, is going to be, again, some sort of a Hamastan, right? It's going to be terrible. And it's not going to be sustainable. And people don't want to put their money there for a conflict to be in motion in 5 years from now, and for the Israelis to respond and bomb these buildings and universities and hospitals and factories that they have built. And to that regard, I absolutely agree that the way out has to include opportunities. However, that is not the first gate to walk through. The first gate, and that is also true of the age that we're living in. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, if you look at the Scientific Revolution, the first gate is to have law and order and people having property rights, not fearing that the government, in this case, the Islamist government, will come and arrest them because they opened up a cinema in Gaza, which Hamas made sure there won't be any after it took control in 2006. Theater groups that closed down, the way that it raided coffee shops, made sure that women can't sit in a coffee shop or couldn't sit in some coffee shops. Now, this changed and morphed over the years, but if you don't go through the first gate of some sort of law and order, some sort of a monopoly over violence, you can expect some kind of a reaction from the government, even if it's not democratic. You're not going to have any sort of human flourishing or economy flourishing in the Gaza Strip. And this is why they really need to be disarmed. And I'm not sure that will be possible, but it's really a necessity for you to invest in the stock called the Gaza Strip, which is, in an undergrad, I wouldn't recommend it right now, but you have a long horizon of investment in front of you, so maybe for you it can work out. For me, I'm going to sit this one out in the next 10 years, but I do think that there is an opportunity there brewing, because Palestinians are incredibly resourceful people because of these experiences. And again, highly educated. And if this society can steer away from fundamentalism, I think that there is an opportunity there. Or I'm trying to convince myself at least.
So maybe we'll just take two more questions, and yeah, if you could just introduce yourselves, and then we'll just take the questions and you can respond to both. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marjorie Mann, and question I have is to pull on that front a little bit, but I heard Abisha Beats on a podcast you're familiar with, talking about essentially what made the future of Gaza akin to the Blair, where you have similar to how Germany was in 1939 until 1949, so like East and West, and essentially staying along the yellow line in the Gaza Strip, allowing resources from the modern Arab countries to pour in and build up their masses of farms. Just wondering if you've heard anything on that, what your thought is, how realistic.
Let me talk based on sources. Tony Blair himself doesn't know what's going to happen in Gaza yet, as far as I know, according to conversation he had in the last 2 weeks. So the answer is, I would find it very hard to believe that those Arab countries are going to start investing in a territory now held under military occupation of the IDF, building houses for a population that doesn't exist over there, in order for this to be a sort of a competition to the rule of Hamas, then allowing the population to migrate or return back to Rafah and Khan Yunis after it was built. It just seems to me very complicated, to say the least. However, if they want to do that, or if Israel wants to start rebuilding itself, that could be very interesting. One of the problems that's going to be created is you don't build it for, right now, there is no real Palestinian population in Rafah or in Khan Yunis. They were evacuated. They live in the Muassi, in the central camp areas. So building it then the population moves in. Usually Hamas moves in with the population. There's no going around this. If Hamas is not going to change, by the way, confiscating weapon, disarming, right now they're already saying, the Arab countries are saying, not Hamas, that they don't mean light arms. They don't mean the Kalashnikovs. Well, you control Gaza through Kalashnikovs. You don't control Gaza with the rockets you shoot against Israel. You control Gaza with sticks and with Kalashnikovs and through legitimacy. And that's the reason why I was so critical of the Israeli government. If you want to win against Hamas, you need to have a competition there that will take over the Palestinian society in Gaza, or for Hamas to change from within. Changing from within, as we know, with these kind of radical movements is going to happen or not happen, I don't know. But there is an adversary there, and that's Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. Weak, it is. Corrupt, absolutely. But it's definitely stronger than any type of opposition supported by the United States in Afghanistan or in Iraq. And it had the international legitimacy that these groups didn't have. And it's already there. So if Israel really wants to win this, it's not about rebuilding the neighborhood. It's about having a legitimate government in Gaza that isn't a puppet government of Hamas, but actually despises Hamas, even if it can't win the battle. It doesn't need to win the battle. They won't win the battle in Ramallah too. It's just because the IDF is around that they're still there. That's fine. But they have international legitimacy. The fact that Israel spends so much time talking about specific militias in Gaza, but it has the Palestinian Authority, it has agreements with the Palestinian Authority, with all its mistakes, with all its wrongdoings, with all the corruption, with all the weakness, it's much bigger, more legitimate, stronger militarily than any of these 20 people militias that have been the subject of so many episodes in Call Me Back. The Palestinian Authority is out there, and they wanted to be part of the solution. They still want to be part of the solution. Again, the base of some parts of the Israeli right wing doesn't want them. Why? Because they represent the legitimacy for Palestinian statehood. And they see this, by the way, to their credit, as more of a strategic threat to Israel than those militias. And they could explain why it's a threat. And I'm not ruling out completely that argument. I'm just saying that this is how it is.
Final question. Yeah.
Jeremy says, not to ask you to predict the outcomes of elections that haven't been called, but we saw a lot of energy from the protests against the changes in the Justice Department in Israel, and a lot of those people took the role of a quasi-governmental support group that felt like it morphed into supporting the families of the hostages. And I'm curious if there are groups and people that you think that we should keep an eye out for who might spring into the political scene and provide a new pressure in Israeli politics.
So in Israeli politics, because it's a coalition-based politics, you always need to look not at the base, but on those that you would call in this country independents specifically. And what you saw with the energy of the protest against the judicial overhaul, that was morphed to some extent to the protest for the hostages, but enjoined with other parts of the Israeli center-right and actual right wing that also joined the protest movement for the hostages. For instance, a person like Einav Tzangauker, who fought for the release of her son Matan Tzangauker, who was a Likud voter her entire life. Or the uncle of Abigail Idan that was kidnapped to Gaza after seeing both of her parents murdered, and who just wrote a post as someone who voted for the Likud his entire life, very much criticizing the government and Mr. Netanyahu. So it wasn't just the same protest movement that's always against Netanyahu that was protesting for the hostages. That's describing this way is just so simplistic, and it's a blatant lie, sometimes made by some elements with a vested interest. However, if you want to really look at what's going to happen in the election, don't look for movements. Look for data. It's not the people who march in the streets. that define election campaigns. It's those who either stay out, don't come to the polls, or are not that interested with politics to the extent of them going to an election. Sometimes it's like seeing demonstrations in Tehran. So if you don't know Tehran, you don't know the streets in which they're protesting, you don't know the demographics, people are overly optimistic that the regime is going to fall. But if you know it's North Tehran, and you know these neighborhoods, you know that they've always been against the revolution. They've always been against the clerics. And it's just now that they feel more free and more legitimate to demonstrate. And what I'm looking at as someone who's been covering Israeli politics for over 20 years now, I'm looking at exactly 7 seats out of 120 that the Likud lost, between 7 and 9, that the Likud lost after the formation of this government, specifically with the judicial overhaul, which was very not popular. And these 7 to 9 seats are mainly Likud seats, but not only Likud seats. Coming from the center of Israel, I can tell you the exact towns and cities. These are urban Likud voters that have simply given up on this government and on this prime minister. And the main question as to Netanyahu's ability to win another election, and he has won more elections than any other leader in an elected democracy in the world by far. So he is a fantastic campaigner. And one should never bury him politically. You know, you shouldn't bury politically President Trump, and you shouldn't definitely not bury politically Prime Minister Netanyahu. So if you look at that, the question is, will he get back those seats of the Likud voters from Ramat Gan, Rishon LeZion, Holon, Bat Yam, somewhat Netanya, Hadera, and the rest, between basically Ashdod to Haifa on the coast. If he gets those 7 seats back, he's going to be the next prime minister. If they maintain their position, they have a better option out there, for instance, Bennett, he's not going to be the prime minister. And this is what the fight is all about. However, because politics is complicated, you also need your base to come and vote for you en masse. And the base of the right wing in Israel is expanding all the time because of demographics, specifically with ultra-Orthodox. And because of that, Netanyahu needs to do both things. Appeal to these rather centrist Likud voters, but also maintain his position in the base. Only Netanyahu can do that, but he's trying to do that. It's going to be extremely, extremely difficult. And I'm not sure the demonstrations and protests are going to help the opposition. Because these Likud voters, they're not too happy with these protests. So more protests, more 200,000 people in Tel Aviv does not equal someone winning the elections. Exactly like in this country. I want to thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
You always have a place here with us. Thank you so much.